Hello everyone, and welcome back to NIGHTHAWKS. Now, I know that this podcast really just talks about a lot of creepy stuff, but today I actually wanted to talk about something more philosophical and just understand why exactly this exists and why we will be talking about fear in a sense, but I just think that this current trend on a lot of meme pages and whatnot actually is something to dive into, understanding how we deal with a lot of things that scare us, like loneliness and just not feeling like we matter. I think that that's something that we all do fear. It's something that we all relate to, so I guess this is just kind of a deep dive onto that and how us as a community on the internet has actually dealt with coping with that. And with that, let's get into today's NIGHTHAWKS, and today we're going to be talking about the doomer. Alright, so if you guys have been on the internet at all, you guys have probably already heard about the doomer. Now, he has a bunch of other characters. There's the boomer, bloomer, gloomer, and zoomer. I know it's very not hard to keep track of, but it's pretty interesting, actually. So today we're just going to be talking about the doomer, and we're going to be touching boomer and bloomer in a bit. But right now, first we're going to talk about the doomer. I know it's pretty confused. Not really a great way to start the podcast, but so the doomer. How exactly do you know what the doomer is? So the doomer, of course, there's an image on it. It's going to be the cover of today's podcast. Basically, this meme of kind of like the, boomer kind of thing. It's basically just a meme associated with different types of generations in current society. So the doomer is described as a male in his early to mid-20s. However, the actual philosophical definition does not limit itself to just being a male in their 20s. But a lot of the times you see the doomer in a lot of memes or videos in these types of scenarios. Usually they feel aimless, or they feel alienated, lonely, and there's just a constant despair in life. That's technically kind of just the philosophical sense of it, as in if you feel any of these, then you might be a doomer, or you might actually be a gloomer. Either way, as I said, philosophically, doomers are very, they feel like life is meaningless, and we'll be getting to that in a bit. But so now that we actually know a little bit more about them, a doomer's life is in their eyes meaningless, and that the world is just doomed by humanity's greed, their ignorance, the selfishness. Basically, that like the world just is not a great place to live in. That's the doomer's mindset. Usually they don't want to engage in traditional pursuits, like, let's say, go to a party, or sometimes they would go out and just go buy a bunch of stuff, or just hang out with friends in general. A doomer usually just doesn't do those types of things, but not just because they don't want to. It's just because that they don't really find a meaning in it, or because they're too busy thinking and they don't actually want to do that. I guess they kind of retreat from society into this kind of apathetic isolation that they kind of force themselves into. A lot of like I said, so this is used in a lot of memes. I guess we kind of talked about that with the backrooms, but it's very interesting how memes deal a lot with horror, and deal a lot with not just horror, but just a lot of psychological or philosophical subjects. So last week we actually talked about the backrooms, which talked about something a lot more psychological, and in this one we're going to talk about something more philosophical. And I guess philosophy can be scary at times. So usually memes illustrate the doomer as working a dead-end job, just struggling with getting over past relationships, or can't really make great relationships with friends and family. Usually they're very pessimistic, and they smoke all the time, or they drink all the time. It's very excessive to the point where they just go home and that's all they do. Usually you see them walking around outside in the rain, smoking a cigarette with a beanie on and a hoodie, just in situations in which they don't really have a lot of distraction, so it's just them and their thoughts. Now, what's interesting is actually that this meme, of course, is very popular and a lot of people relate to it. And it's very telling of the conditions of the modern person, specifically the current young adult generation. And I guess the doomer can just be just described as pessimistic, filled with nihilism, and this hopeless for the now and the future. So what's interesting about this is that it's a character that a lot of people just kind of insert themselves in. It's kind of a self-insert. So the doomer usually is described is that a doomer grows up in or around the 90s, where technology began to grow too fast and too short of a time. Basically, to the point where you grew up with something as simple as a computer, but then literally 10 years later, you have the entire internet in your pocket. Internet devices pretty much changed exactly how we experienced and understood the world. Children and young adults have the ability to have this new communication system just to connect the entire world. And what makes it interesting is that looking at a phone and knowing that you can literally communicate to anyone in the entire world through this internet, it basically shrinks the world into the size of your phone, and you see the chaos and just the absurdity of the entire world in the palm of your hand. It basically shrinks the world to be much smaller into the size where it can fit in your hand. That itself is scary, because looking at it, you're basically looking at the entirety of the world, realizing how meaningless it is. Because you know how a lot of people say they have those videos on Twitter or something of, let's say, like a rocket, which basically has a camera on it, and then they launch all the way away from space, all the way until the end of the universe, until you realize, wow, we really are tiny and insignificant. That's basically what the smartphones are doing now, connected with the internet. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Obviously, we can connect to a lot of people that we just can't communicate with often. But I'm talking more in regards of social media, Reddit, Google. We are connected to a lot of other people, but then we find these websites, and then we find these posts about things that, and you're saying a human made that is reflecting of what people here are making, what people here are doing, what people here are thinking, and it basically shrinks the world into the small, basically the size of your phone. And I think that there is some kind of fear to that. I think that is kind of scary. It's scary to think of your entire life and everyone's life as just insignificant, knowing how small, if you were to compare it to such a big grand scheme, it's just so small. But we'll get to that in a bit, but just keep that in the back of your minds. So now that we talked a little bit about the doomer, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the boomer, just for a little bit of context. So like I said, the doomer grew up in or around the 90s, and the boomer actually grew up between 1946 and 1964. So the boomer is actually very representative of the age or generation in which their outlook on life is very positive, and they have a very can-do attitude. It's very naive, and they're very blissfully ignorant of the entire truth. They just kind of go along with life unaware of their reality, thinking that they have everything under control. Pretty much what a lot of people would just say is a dad going through their midlife crisis. Now, the thing is that, back to the whole technology expanding in an unprecedented rate, there's basically this entire generation that just relates to this world that just isn't positive all the time. On the internet, you find a bunch of things that just are not necessarily the greatest things ever. And the boomers' philosophy is outdated at that point, and this generation is left with no traditional meaning to fall back on. Of course, if you think about the setting of the time, 1946, that's after World War II, and of course there's this big boom in Christianity, and it's just something that people can rely on. And I feel like now, with the doomer, they don't really have a set of, I'm not saying that they don't have a set of morals to fall back on, but they don't have a belief system that they can just rely on. So of course that just leads the doomer just to focus on themselves and fall into this nihilism. Now, before we go on with all the creepy stuff, I wanted to take a break and talk about Inherited Madness. That is this novel that I've been working on for the past 8 months. It's finally been published, and basically I'm just really glad that now people are kind of interested in this thing that I basically wrote with my own two hands, and it was super fun to make, and I hope you guys are also interested in it. It's a crime novel about a priest who becomes a serial killer in the 1950s. The story actually follows this author who is investigating it in the 1980s after the priest has actually been convicted. There's actually, my favorite character is the author. He actually goes through a lot. We see a lot of scenes through the thoughts of the author and just his entire process of just understanding this entire case, and just basically understanding that these were real women who were killed, and just how exactly he deals with that. Anyway, I thought it was just really fun, really interesting just to get into the mind of all these other kinds of people, and it was just so much fun to write, and I hope you guys have as much fun reading it as I did writing it. And with that, the link is in the description, and let's get back into talking about the Doomer. Now, we already talked about some things such as nihilism, and basically the fact that if we pull away from the earth just a bit, we actually see how insignificant our lives really are. And I've already talked a little bit about infinity and how insignificality in your life, and thinking that your life is insignificant, that is scary and that is horrifying. And it was in my first Nighthawks episode I talked about insignificance, and how that whole idea of just that anything that we do just won't leave a lasting impact. I think that that's one of the biggest fears, if not the biggest fear of humans, just not leaving an impact or anything in anyone, or with any person, or in the lasting universe, Today we're going to be talking about two 19th century philosophers. That's Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Arthur Schopenhauer is quoted as being the philosopher of pessimism. Basically, life is riddled with unavoidable pain, meaninglessness, and we're just prisoners to our instinct to survive, reproduce, and remain existing, and that's all that life is. According to Schopenhauer, all that life is a product of this force. There's no purpose but to survive. And according to him, life is just this delusion, to impress sexual partners in order to reproduce, and then accomplish things just to be happy. So there's a quote by Arthur Schopenhauer, and it says this: "There is only one inborn error, and that is the notion that we exist in order to be happy. So long as we persist in this inborn error, the world seems to us full of contradictions, for at every step in things great and small, we are bound to experience that the world and life are certainly not arranged for the purpose of maintaining a happy existence." So according to Schopenhauer, with some honest examination on our life, and basically going to the very root of what exactly our life is, what is that thing, Occam's razor, where, basically cut something down to its simplest form. If we were to do that with life, that we don't necessarily need to live to be happy, much like what the Doomer is thinking. That's kind of the philosophy that the Doomer has. And not necessarily that they're wrong. There is chaos and there is pain and meaninglessness in the world, but the problem isn't with the Doomer realizing that. It's how exactly they cope with that. And I feel like it also plays back into the whole fear. It's not necessarily the fear of us being meaningless. It's what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we going to make our life worth living, or are we going to make our life a horrible living hell because of it? Schopenhauer actually offered two solutions to this realization of life's meaninglessness and suffering. That's art and asceticism. Now, first, let's talk about asceticism. Now, that's basically the discipline of the avoidance of pleasure and overcoming the unconscious desire in pursuit of the selfish and material. And that means sex, money, power. It's basically just not wanting to want, and basically just going back into, it's basically just not wanting to want, and it's basically just getting everything. It's basically that desire that we have for physical things, or the desire that we have for any kind of like government or anything like that, just any kind of power placement, or any kind of physical thing that anyone can, any kind of possession, I guess. It's basically just saying, I do not want that. or it's not saying that I don't want that. It's basically disciplining yourself to say, I don't need that. As much as I want it, I don't need it, because it will not bring me happiness. And basically Schopenhauer thinks this as taking control of your selfishness and then finding your happiness in that present moment. It's very difficult, and Schopenhauer even says that it's a very difficult thing to actually feat, but it is worth it. In his opinion, if you want that kind of happiness, that is an option. Now let's talk about Schopenhauer's offering of art. Now that's pretty much things like theater, music, poetry, painting, literature, theory, philosophy, basically to liberate the individual the moment they're experiencing it. So, let's say if it's even this, let's say, this is technically a kind of art, if I didn't have this podcast, or if I didn't have my YouTube channel, then my life would feel like it didn't have a meaning. Obviously, my entire life isn't just this podcast or my channel, but it does bring a sense of I'm living for a reason, and that's to record these, edit these, upload these, and then talk to you guys and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like without it, I mean, even just having it, I feel like having art, more like doing the art, I feel like I have a purpose. And then the kind of you guys relating to my art, I also feel like that also gives me a lot of purpose. And I feel like if I didn't have that, if something was threatening that, if something was threatening my career or my art or anything like that, then I would feel meaningless. Then I'd feel scared. I would honestly feel terrified. I'd feel threatened if there was any kind of chance that I would not be able to make any kind of video or make any kind of podcast ever, because I mean that's just the way that's just the art style that I have. That's just what I want to do, and like I said, that's kind of what I've built the meaning behind. And as Schopenhauer says, making this art, it fills us with meaning. It gives us a reason to actually be involved in other people. It gives other people a chance to relate to us and be close to us. When we do this art, we feel less imprisoned and less delusioned. One doesn't necessarily have to find something worthwhile in the traditional and materialistic world beyond the mere expression of pain and disinterest. And the pain and absurdity is transmuted in purpose for oneself and others. So the doomer actually embodies this idea, creating these memes. When people make memes about the doomer in these various situations, like I said, a dead-end job, or whether they're, just at home listening to sad music, smoking and drinking, these are ways that they make their pain into art. They make it into something that can be shared, and then people can point to that and say, I understand that, I relate to that, this is something meaningful. And then in return, that makes the other person not feel as alone. That's kind of why memes are created. And it's basically just to deal with that feeling of loneliness, or feeling like you're just not relating to anyone. So the doomer itself, if anything, was created from this philosophy of making art in order to connect with someone else. And if anything, Schopenhauer's answers actually do make a lot more sense in this kind of context. So the doomer actually does embody Schopenhauer's answer of art, because, if anything, the doomer would not exist if it wasn't for this philosophy. People would not want to make the doomer if they did not find something relatable in him in order to share him. Now let's talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and nihilism. And basically, nihilism is just the belief in nothing. Life is and always will involve some type of suffering through its meaningless. And Nietzsche found that traditional religion did not help the modern person in dealing with pain, and so nihilism was the only rational approach. The meaningless doesn't mean that we should give up, but the realization that life is meaningless actually makes the person look inside and create their own meaning and self-identity. Now, a lot of people could actually relate to this, because I'm not necessarily saying that I fall under nihilism But I do say that, of course, there's that whole, you understand, yes, the entire world is meaningless. We're all going to die. Obviously, that's just like just something that is the truth. That is the truth that of this world, and that's just going to happen. Obviously, the entire universe is going to freeze over at the end of time and blah, 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 blah. And obviously, these are things that we just can't escape. But the fact that I am right here, right now, recording this, the fact that I am perceiving this life, this complex life of touch, taste, sight, and every other kind of sense, and the fact that I can make human connections with all my friends and family, and the fact that I can do this, I see it as not just like a blessing. I see it, well, of course, it's, pretty much impossible. Like somehow the earth was in the exact right situation in order to make life and in order to make us, but somehow just the fact that I am here, the fact that I am lucky enough to even exist in this exact moment is just breathtakingly insane. And I understand that obviously once I die, there will be no way that I can be remembered in the entirety of the universe after every single atom has been taken into black holes, consumed, and then spit back out into these molecules that will forever be frozen and stopping time itself. Now, I'm not analyzing the doomer to see what exactly the doomer does to scare us or anything like that, but instead, I'm actually seeing why the doomer is a perfect example of how we cope with fear. And I think that the biggest fear, as I'd said, I was just describing pretty much the end of time. And even when I describe it, it's scary. It's scary to think that I will be basically everything that I own and everything that I am and my entire family and everything will just be reduced to tiny molecules that won't even be moving to the point where time is meaningless. That is horrifying. That is horrifyingly scary, because then that just makes our entire life feel meaningless. And there's that meaninglessness that is horrifying. And I feel like there is something scary in meaninglessness, because we feel that we don't necessarily have a purpose in life. And as humans, as I think there was Schopenhauer had said that as humans we are looking for that meaning, whether it be through art or whether it be through asceticism. I think that there is that fear of feeling alone, and that fear of just feeling just empty and feeling meaningless, and that is a fear that a lot of people have. It's just meaningless, and let's just get that out of the way. Fear, the topic of fear here is meaninglessness and just our futility, the fact that we are going to die, and the fact that we are literally alone in this universe. Just that is kind of the topic of what we are afraid of here. But if we were to somehow cope with that, how would we do that? And I feel like this meme, Doomer, itself is actually a way to cope with that. It is a way to point at ourselves and laugh and say, wow, that is me, and at least I'm not alone. And I feel like that is just such an interesting use of this. And I feel like the Doomer himself not only just emulates us and emulates our fears and how we cope with that fear, he is a way that we cope with our fear. Not only do we cope with our fears with drinking and smoking and reminiscing about our past relationships and then worrying about what our family and our friends think about us, not only do we do that, we also make these things such as, hey, this person, this Doomer character accurately represents how I feel. It accurately represents, the things that I worry about, the fears that I have, and the fact that other people see that and say, oh my God, I feel the exact same way, and that's how I cope with my things. That also just reduces that meaninglessness. It makes us feel like we're just not alone, and that is kind of just the best way to deal with fear. And that's with comedy. That's with laughing at what exactly we do in order to deal with these types of things. Which brings us back to Nietzsche. But before we get into Nietzsche, I actually wanted to talk about something interesting, and that is just the internet and what exactly it represents. Now, the internet is basically a compounded version of social pressure and its detachment. But alienation and despair that we feel is just natural when we're on the internet and we feel, let's say, just very alone, or we feel like just very small in this big sea of just people. We understand that is natural, and one must walk through that horrible kind of muddy, foggy, misty pain in order to realize that there are pains and challenges. And instead of facing away from them, we have to lean into them and face them head on, no matter how painful it is. Realizing, yes, I am going to be alone, instead of turning away from that and thinking, no, I am not alone. Facing it and saying, yes, I'm alone, but how can I deal with that? That is what Nietzsche wants. Now, Nietzsche says that the key to suffering is knowing how to use that suffering. Here's one of his quotes. I assess the power of a will by how much resistance, pain, torture it endures, and knows how to turn it in its advantage. By inviting suffering in and recognizing it as an opportunity to develop wisdom and resilience, we actually utilize it as a method in realizing our own greatness and purpose. Basically, by just using that fear and that loneliness and that pain, and instead of just using it as something to make us sad and to make us cry, actually using it in a way to better ourselves and to make us happy and to make us find purpose. That's basically why we suffer in the first place, is to using it into bettering ourselves and better our understanding on not only ourselves, of others, and to actually just make our own purpose. Now, pain and meaningless is, if anything, fundamental in life, and we shouldn't make ourselves lethargic or indifferent. In fact, we need to just realize that a fundamental part of our life is pain and meaningless. We have to face that fear. From both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, the greatest reason for our life is found in that self-realization and self-expressions for one's unique truth. We have to somehow turn that pain into something to marvel at, into a better understanding of ourselves, and just to give us purpose. And if we can accept our suffering and work against our human nature and just work well into our interests and engaging activities, we can actually build a life that's not only worth living, but just is just full of purpose in this world of chaos, doom, futility, selfishness, and overall meaninglessness. Now, there is one character that I failed to mention, and that is basically the opposite of the doomer, or if a lot of people would say, what comes after the doomer, and that is the bloomer. So the bloomer actually possesses the awareness of the sad and painful realities of life, but instead of just feeling sad and feeling lonely and feeling alienated, much like the doomer, it actually listened to Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and actually sees that there is still things that can be marveled at in the world, that there is still a lot to be wondered about and still a lot to experience. In the mind of the bloomer, the world may be messy and the world may be chaotic and full of these horrible, horrible things, but it's still worth living, and it's still worth making something meaningful from it. Now, I didn't necessarily want to make this podcast very inspirational. I'm sorry if it did, but I mean, if you guys were inspired by it, sure, but just realize that, you know, if you ever feel some kind of fear or some kind of pain, much like just understanding that you are not, meaningful, just face that and say, how can I make my own meaning, or anything like that. I think existentialism in general is kind of the biggest fear in a lot of people. Just why do we exist, and what exactly is the meaning of life? I feel like a lot of people are scared of that and are just afraid to ask themselves that question. But if we ask ourselves that and learn from it and try to use it in order to better understand ourselves, I feel like we could actually be a lot better and in actually understanding fear and just why, like, basically overcoming a lot of things that we would just be too afraid to do on our own. And with that, thank you guys so much for listening. If you guys enjoyed this, please follow the podcast, or just go to my YouTube channel. I have a lot more content over there. You can watch the first few Nighthawks episodes there. And thank you guys so much for joining me. Next week, I will be uploading another episode, so make sure to check that out. And thank you again for joining, and make sure you guys read something that'll keep you up at night.